what does this pressure campaign look like when it comes to the U.S. position of global trust across the world economy?
I think it's important for us not to look at this as an attack on one individual Fed governor, but an attack on an institution. And the independence of the Federal Reserve has been at its core central to the confidence that investors around the world have in the U.S. economy. You know, in my old job, one of the things I did was meet with investors in the United States, but people around the world who wanted to deploy capital here in the United States. And one of the reasons they felt confident doing that was because of the rule of law and because of the strength of our institutions. One of the strongest institutions has been the Federal Reserve, and maintaining that independence is key to our economic growth. So the calls for various Fed governors to resign, who are both Democrats and Republicans, but frankly, all of whom have focused on the data rather than politics, undermines one of the key strengths of the economy.
Well, a quick follow on this notion of trust. What does this mean, for instance, in the world's trust in the dollar, the global reserve currency?
The reality is that one of the things the Fed is charged with is making monetary policy decisions. Ultimately, those decisions that they make, those calls that they make, being independent of political interference, is one of the reasons that countries around the world are willing to lend money to the United States, knowing that the Fed is going to make a decision based on its dual mandate, not based on politics, regardless of if the president is a Democrat or a Republican. Having that confidence in the Fed is important to not Democrats and Republicans, but to Americans in terms of our ability to make sure that we have an economy that continues to grow.
Well, of course, at the moment, the Fed's monetary policy and this wait-and-see mode that we've seen from the central bank does have to do with the president's tariff plans. And you had a really interesting piece in Foreign Affairs, and I wanted to pull a quote from it, where you write that, quote, Trump deserves some credit for forcing the world to grapple with the failures of the existing global trade order. Decades of deindustrialization have harmed large swaths of the American workforce and undermined U.S. national security by creating supply chain dependencies on potential adversaries. So when we are looking holistically at the White House's tariff plans, these trade policies, what in your view is working versus what isn't so much?
What the president has done is focused attention on the issue, but ultimately what we need is a trade strategy that lowers costs for the American people, creates more manufacturing jobs for our workers and our companies, but allows Americans to be able to export things to the rest of the world. What is working is that the president has drawn attention to the issue. The challenge, of course, is that the tariff strategy that he's put in place is increasing costs on Americans. The best example of this is you look at the F-150 truck, which is made here in the United States. The F-150, when you look at the tariff taxes on that vehicle, is going to cost more than, for example, a Toyota. An F-150 made here in the United States is going to cost more for tariffs than a Toyota vehicle made in Japan, shipped to the United States. That can't be an outcome that anyone wants.
And part of the administration's push has been this idea of national security. We've seen the Section 232 tariffs enacted on it, and you talk about this emphasis on national security carve-outs. Talk to us about the balance here that the administration would need to thread when you hear perhaps the current Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talk about the difference between decoupling versus de-risking when we are looking at those countries where we have those national security concerns like China.
I think one of the most important things about the national security issues that we deal with is that they be done in a bipartisan way. That's what we did with the CHIPS and Science Act, which is allowing America to build chips in a cutting-edge way. But we have to separate out what is national security versus what is economics. I've seen some say that building textiles and building shoes here in the United States is a key to national security. That can't be true. We need to focus on true national security concerns, be they chips or be they things like critical minerals that are key to our defense industrial base, because doing so will allow us to invest in these things, protect the United States, but also allow American companies and firms to compete with the rest of the world. We're in the middle of earnings season, and when you hear these CEOs talk, they're making very clear that tariffs are costing them money, and that they're planning to pass on those costs to their consumers. That isn't in anyone's interest. We need a strategy that allows American companies to grow, workers to earn money, and for us to sell American goods around the world.
Wally, you brought up the CHIPS and Science Act. We're seeing, and Bloomberg has broken the news, that the administration is weighing whether to use some of that CHIPS Act money to take an equity stake in Intel and perhaps even other companies. Now, Is this a good use or even proper use of that money? And is this an effective strategy to have the government taking essentially an ownership stake in companies like that?
My view is that I believe in the private sector and its ability to innovate, and government should largely stay out of running private companies unless it's absolutely necessary. Based on what we've seen in terms of private investments in Intel, I think the key is to make sure that what government does, especially with the CHIPS and Science money, is that we create incentives for these companies that allow them to create good-paying jobs here in the United States and unlock the ability of the private sector to deliver for the American people. When the CHIPS and Science Act was passed, as I mentioned, it was done on a bipartisan basis because we knew that in addition to national security concerns, we wanted to make sure we had the ability to create good-paying jobs here in the United States. The goal was not for the United States government to be the driver of chip creation. We wanted to make sure that American companies not only built chips for America, but to my point, that the chips that were built here, we could ship to the rest of the world so American jobs could be created shipping things across the world.
So just moving forward here, when you do see the administration take perhaps more hands-on industrial policy, we saw this with the Nippon deal, for example, and the so-called golden share. How do you see this evolving if this already appears to be the path that at least this administration's already on?
And I think that the reality was that in the Biden administration, there was a great deal done when it came to industrial policy as well. The question really is around, are you creating incentives and then allowing the private sector to take it from there? Or is the government taking ownership stake and actually controlling companies in the economy? My view is that we should let the private sector do what it does well, which is innovate, create jobs, and move forward. But in some cases, it's important for the United States government to create incentives. That's what we've done on CHIPS and Science. That's what we need to do in select industries that are key to our national security and to building out our economy. The challenge, of course, is that tariffs, instead of creating those opportunities to create jobs, what we're seeing today is those tariffs are increasing the cost for consumers and making it harder for our companies to operate.
How soon are we going to start seeing some of those costs really play their way through the economy from businesses and then to consumers?
And I think people have been surprised that you haven't seen more of that already. But when you listen to these earnings calls, these CEOs are making clear that they're starting to see those costs increase and they're going to pass them on to consumers. I think the challenge today is that as you look at the labor market and you're starting to see apparel cost, and as parents get ready to go shopping for back to school, they're going to see potentially higher cost for clothing. And these companies are seeing higher cost for inputs. And what that naturally means is that American companies are going to be less competitive vis-a-vis companies in China or companies in the rest of the world, which isn't anyone's goal. That's why we think that it's important for us to work together with our allies and partners to lower tariffs and then to jointly confront China in a way that allows us to create jobs, to lower costs, and also to create opportunities for American companies to sell things not just here in the United States, but around the world.